We're delighted you're here. Let me introduce David Capes. David has become a dear friend to me, to Mark Lanier, to all of our staff here at the Lanier Library. And he has helped us in innumerable ways. I think primarily of the ways in which he has helped us connect with the families of some of the scholars whose private collections we've been able to purchase. Alan Siegel's wonderful collection, which is really mostly scattered throughout the library, but as you enter the front door, immediately on your right, there are several, maybe 20 or so shelves of his books. Outstanding scholar up in the Northeast, Columbia University. And David has helped us in so many other ways, helping us secure some of our lecturers and just being an advisor and a encourager in lots of ways. David is former professor for many years at Houston Baptist University, and PhD from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is now academic dean at Houston Graduate School of Theology. Would you welcome him as he comes up to introduce our panel, please?
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Charles. It is great to be here with you today, and looking forward to this opportunity to have dialogue with these scholars for a while. They are fortunate because I am not a lawyer. I've never cross-examined anybody. I've never deposed anybody. I have made a few graduate students cry, though, when I turn back their papers. So that happens sometimes. But this is going to be a very soft and wonderful conversation we have today on a couple of topics that we'll discuss in just a moment. You see, before you, our first discussion is on a fragment known today as the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And thanks to Brent and Charles and others, we've got a very good, and I think Simon, too, provided this image, a very wonderful image. By the way, it's not this big in real life. It's much smaller than that. So you'll get a sense. But let me introduce our panelists today as we get started. Let's start off with Dr. Craig Evans. Dr. Evans, if you'll come on and join us and sit right down here. Dr. Evans has just come to Houston, I think just a few months ago, as the Dean of the School of Christian Thought at Houston Baptist University. I left so that to make room for him. He should be, I'm just kidding, I didn't do that. He has a BA in History and Philosophy from Claremont McKenna College, an MDiv from Western Seminary, MA and a PhD in Biblical Studies from Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. Until recently, he was the Payzant Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Acadia Divinity College in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. So we are glad to have him. He spent 35 years in Canada, originally from the United States, but spent 35 years there. I probably have more books by Dr. Evans in my library than any other scholar. And so he's prolific, written a lot on the historical Jesus. He's written on archaeology, material culture from the ancient world, as well as Dead Sea Scrolls and other things. So would you welcome Dr. Craig Evans? Let's do Graham Cole. Graham, come on next. Since you're such an edgy scholar, we're going to put you on the edge down there, that edge. Theologians are edgy people. He's the Dean of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. This is his first visit to the library and to the Stone Chapel. He's professor of Biblical and Systematic Theology. There, when he begins to speak, you realize he's not from these parts. He's from Australia. He and his wife have joined us, but now living in Chicago. He has a BA at MTH from the University of Sydney, Bachelor of Divinity from the University of London, and a THD from the Australian College of Theology, among other degrees as well. He's ordained in the Anglican tradition, and he has taught at a variety of schools in Australia, but also in America. Recently, he was down in Beeson Divinity School at Samford University, but he has gone back more recently. And I think I met you this past year in Pittsburgh. He's a new dean, I'm a new dean, and so we had a gathering at our accreditation offices up there. But he has written as well in a number of things. The Doctrine of the Holy Spirit, He Who Gives Life, a book with Crossway. God the Peacemaker, How Atonement Brings Shalom. We're going to be probably chatting about that today. The God Who Became Human, a biblical theology of incarnation with IVP academic press. Please welcome Dr. Cole with us. David Moessner. We're going to get David to come on up. David, you, if you would sit right next to Graham there. David is his first time too, as well, at the Stone Chapel and the library. He is the A.A. Bradford Chair in the Religion Department at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. He has a B.A. in Theology from the University of Oxford, a B.A. in Religion from Princeton University, an M.Div. from Princeton as well, and a Doctor of Theology from the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was a student of Bo Reicha, as was one of my teachers, Dr. Robert Sloan, now president of Houston Baptist University. He's written a number of books and monographs: Paul and the Heritage of Israel, which is one I need to get. I haven't gotten that one yet. Jesus and the Heritage of Israel. He's on a roll here. The Lord of the Banquet, and other books as well. Dr. Moessner, we welcome you. Thank you for being a part of this. Last but not least, Professor Simon Gathercole. Please join us here at the front table. A reader in New Testament studies, a fellow at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge University, an elder at his church, Eden Baptist Church in Cambridge. He did his PhD under Jimmy Dunn, fellow many of us know and have known for many years, and he's one of the bright and rising New Testament scholars in the world. He's written a lot about Christology, the preexistence of Christ, in a little book that I got a few years ago, probably the first book I read of yours, which is on the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and arguing that there is preexistent Christology there in those early Gospels. He's written this book that we're going to be talking about today, Defending Substitution, an essay on atonement on Paul, and it contributed to an essay, How God Became Jesus, the Real Origins of Belief in Jesus' Divine Nature, and the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. He's written widely. Let's welcome Professor Gathercole. All right. With those niceties done, gentlemen, you see behind you a fragment of a gospel, and what? What are you laughing at? Oh, you're already laughing. No, I'm serious. You're serious. All right, you're a serious scholar. He's already interested. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we see here. Simon, you've written on this recently, published an article in New Testament Studies. Tell us what we're looking at here. Give us a description. And by the way, we're so high tech, we have a little laser pointer in case you want to show us anything cool there.
Well, I think Dr. Cape said at the beginning that it wasn't actually really this big.
It's not that big.
That's certainly true. It's actually about the size of a business card or a credit card. So imagine this sort of compressed into that space.
Increase the volume just a little bit. A little bit loud. Yeah, we're going to do that. Thanks, Brent.
And this is the fragment that was announced in 2012 as the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And the reason, if I can get this to work. The reason for this is that, here you have the word, the Coptic. This is written in Coptic, which is basically an updated dialect of hieroglyphic Egyptian, written in Greek characters, and it has the key words on here. There said, Pege, Jesus. That's the abbreviated form of Jesus, as you see in lots of manuscripts, probably up here somewhere as well. So Jesus said now to them, Tahime, my wife, literally the of me wife or woman there. So those are the words which have attracted all the attention and which led the person who initially publicized this fragment to call it the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. That was Professor Karen King of Harvard Divinity School.
Okay. All right, so it's about the size of a business card. What is it written on?
It's written on papyrus.
Papyrus.
And so
anything on the back side of it?
Yeah, there are a few letters on the back, but nothing that's very easy to identify. This front half, or actually the back, but it's this which is the key sort of load-bearing wall. And so initially, what led some people at least to think that it was an authentic ancient document was that it really is written on papyrus, and it really is written on ancient papyrus, what looks like ancient papyrus.
Can't we date that papyrus? Can't we do something to say how old it is?
Yeah, the way we date lots of ancient texts is by what's called radiocarbon dating. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I don't particularly understand all the details of this.
Well, we have one here in the wing, so in case you need any scientific advice, we can bring it in.
But it's based on the amount that the carbon has decayed in a certain way, so that you can date pieces of papyrus often to within a couple of centuries. It's getting better, I think. So now you can often position it within a century date. But when Karen King first looked at this, she thought it looks like a lot of the manuscripts that we have from the 4th century. 4th century AD, that is. And
that's based upon what? What is she basing that 4th century date on?
Well, the thing that this was compared to was the corpus of manuscripts from Nag Hammadi, an Egyptian find full of documents of a kind of unorthodox form of Christianity, and this was thought to be like those. They can be fairly securely dated because of other stuff that was found with them, letters that are dated, that were found with the sort of embedded in the binding. So we can be a little bit more certain about the dating of the Nag Hammadi text. And so this was thought, well, this is a bit like those from roughly the 4th, 5th century. So that's probably when this dates from.
Can you give us a sense, other than the fact that it refers to Jesus said to them, "My wife," what else is this document about exactly?
Well, one of the key words here, which you may be able to identify, is Mariam, which is Mary, and so it's often assumed that I can see it much better over there actually. It's often thought that the wife here is Mary, and a lot of the discussion in this manuscript is really about whether Mary can really be a disciple of Jesus.
And this would be Mary, not the mother of Jesus, but Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, probably Mary Magdalene. I mean, one of the interesting things that one finds in early Christianity, though, is that the various Marys often get mixed up. So, if you remember from the Gospels, there's Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and she often gets conflated with Mary Magdalene. And so this may be a sort of composite Mary.
The first line says something about the mother of Jesus too, doesn't it? Something like that?
Yeah, that's
the
right.
very first line?
Yeah.
So this wouldn't be Mary, the mother of Jesus, this third line, right? But probably...
Yeah, you've got the word Mao. You know, lots of languages have words for mother beginning with M.
Is this like Ma?
Yeah, like Ma.
Ma?
So,
my Ma?
So yeah, if you're from the south. And yes, it says my mother, she gave me something, and it tails off there, and it's probably goes on to say gave me life, which is something we find in...
Part of the word for life is started there, right?
Yeah,
you had a letter. Right,
well, yeah, you have the definite article there, and then the first half of a letter. So.
Pass the mic, if you will, to Dr. Evans here. Craig, let me ask this. It's called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Is this a gospel? Is it from a gospel?
Well, we have no idea because we have just a small fragment about this size. And so what the wider context would be is hard to say. But it's been created to look like a typical Gnostic gospel, which is usually a lot of dialogue.
So Jesus speaking to someone else, disciples.
Favored disciples. The typical theme that you find like at Nag Hammadi that Simon just mentioned, that's a place in Egypt, and that's where 13 or so leather-bound old codices came to light, ranging in date from the middle of the 4th century to the end of the 4th century. The Gospel of Thomas, by the way, in its full form was found in Codex number 2. And so several of these are Gospels of sorts. where the risen Jesus appears and dialogues either with well-known disciples like Peter and John, or disciples who aren't so well-known like Philip or Mary Magdalene. And invariably in these texts, Jesus reveals things that he never talks about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, in the first century Gospels of the New Testament. So it's a special, it's new revelation, it's new material. And I think the idea is, well, Jesus said things prior to his passion and his resurrection that were only at a certain level, kind of earthbound. But now, having been to heaven, having been glorified and everything else, he's got the real serious stuff that he will divulge to a very narrow, private, elect few.
So is there any, and I'm just curious, anybody here can chime in on this one if you would, is there any propaganda value to calling this a gospel, do you think? David?
Yes, when you say something is a gospel, you immediately think of the church's gospels, and you immediately think of some story, right?
Hold that just a little closer if you don't mind.
When you think of gospel, you immediately think of the church's gospels, and therefore some story about Jesus that's more than just a fragment or a little saying taken out of context, and no one knows what that context is. So to say this is the gospel of Jesus' wife is really, I think, misleading and trying to say something that cannot in any way, shape, or form be proven. Now, perhaps it's possible this came from a manuscript that would be a larger story, and someday maybe it's discoverable, or it will be discovered. But
at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, it says the Gospel of Thomas, right? As I remember, the very last line, it says the Gospel of Thomas.
But remember, the Gospel of Thomas is long enough to have some kind of understanding of who Jesus is, what he says, and the kinds of things he says. It's not narrative, but it's still a list of sayings of Jesus on various topics. So the Gospel of Thomas is the exception here. Most of the Gospels we have from the Nag Hammadi, Egyptian Nile Delta area, are fragments, and the Gospel of Judas would be one of the longer ones now. So perhaps some of you will talk about that. But
pass that on down to Graham for just a moment. And a lot of folks will make a comparison between this fragment, often I think mischaracterized as the Gospel of Jesus' wife, to the Gospel of Philip. Now, you may not have heard of the Gospel of Philip, but it's one of many sort of Gnostic Gospels. And it's been compared to that because Mary plays a very significant role in that. So, Graham, in the Gospel of Philip, Jesus is described as having an intimate relationship. There's certain language there about companion and partner that seems to have, and some people have argued, has a sexual sort of overtone. But Simon, in his article, says that that's really about Mary having been a recipient of revelation that wasn't available to others. Why is there a connection, and we see this in other church history as well, between this sexuality but also spiritual revelation?
I think what we see in the early church is that some embraced a kind of sensuality. These are people that are not mainstream but on the margins. Others embraced a kind of asceticism. And so you have more than one kind of response. But what I think is particularly interesting is the accent on knowledge, and hence we get Gnostics and Gnosticism, because really what it is at the heart is to have a message and a secret information that can actually be spiritually elevating, as opposed to having a savior who delivers you from sin and moral guilt per se. And so when it comes to, say, the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Judas or this particular fragment, what strikes me is how imitative it is.
How what it is?
Imitative. How parasitic it is. There has to be other literature, Gospels, Acts, letters, that do have an authority that's recognized, that make it desirable to so imitate. And I think one of my questions to the panelists who are specialists in New Testament and this sort of literature, I'm a poor theologian. One of the differences is this, that someone has said a scholar is someone who wants to know everything about something. A theologian is someone who wants to know something about everything. So that's why I'm sitting on the edge here. But I'd be really interested in knowing what they think was so attractive about this kind of literature, whether it had a sensual accent or had an aesthetic accent.
David, you want to take that? Okay. Simon?
I think one of the attractive things about many of these Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, perhaps, I mean, and one shouldn't overemphasize the attractiveness, I think, because many of these groups that made use of the Gospel of Thomas and other related Gospels were actually very small. So the Gospel of Thomas itself has one saying of Jesus where Jesus is purported to have said, "I will choose you 1 out of 1,000 and 2 out of 10,000," giving the impression, as one sometimes finds in the other text as well, that you who receive this are the elite minority. And I think that elite minority idea was what was really attractive to those who did embrace it. The Gospels are sort of for the rough and ready fisherman. The New Testament Gospels are for the rough and ready fisherman, whereas what we can provide you with through the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip is something which is much more intellectual, much more virtuosic, much more elevated, that elevates you above the unwashed masses.
Craig, you want to take a shot at that sort of idea, the traction?
Well, I think Graham made a good point about these writings clearly presuppose, if you read them critically, they presuppose the first century writings that become part of the New Testament, whatever we want to say about canon consciousness in the second century when these kinds of writings, not this by the way, but Gospel of Thomas and some of the other Gnostic writings came to be written. And so what I think was going on was a desire to push the theological boundaries of what we might call proto-orthodoxy. It would be anachronistic to talk about orthodoxy exactly, but there was an understanding of what Jesus really taught and what his disciples, his apostles, really taught. And some groups wanted a little more something else added to it, Neoplatonism of one form or another, a radical dualism or whatever it was. And so how do you need an alibi? How do you come up with new teaching that you have to run back to Jesus because he's the ultimate source? And this is teaching that nobody has heard for 100 years. It's never been heard. And now you're going to cook it up in the year 130, 140, 150, somewhere in there. And so you create an alibi. And that's where you get the secret revelation. Apocalyptic literature does that in its own form. So somebody has a special moment where something is revealed. So 1, 2, 3 apostles or irregulars like Philip or Thomas or Mary. And so that's how this works. And by the way, that's what creates, I'm going to go back to what David was touching on a few minutes ago. That's how we get this romance thing. That's not what anybody was talking about. That's not what anybody meant then. But that's what paves the way for Dan Brown. And so in the Gospel of Philip, you have a place where it says, trying to explain how it is Jesus would reveal such deep truths to Mary. I mean, who's Mary? She's not one of the original 12. Well, he loved her and used to kiss her on her boop, and there's a hole in the text. It's like some censor. Actually, it was a censor worm that ate the little hole. Anyway, we don't know what the word was. Kissed her on her nose, on her forehead, on her, yeah, on her birthday. And anyway, and so, now the modern goes, oh my gosh, Jesus used to kiss Mary. And in the Gospel of Mary, there's actual reference to, Peter is pouting. He's really upset. And Mary's crying, well, why do you call me a liar? Because she's revealing to the disciples things that Jesus never had taught them. And, of course, it notes that Jesus loved her. And as much as he loved the men, even more. And so the modern reading says this must be romance. But if you go back to ancient sources, sources talked about men loving men, and there's no erotic, there's no There's no romance involved at all. In fact, kissing, Judas, after all, kissed Jesus. Kissing doesn't mean romance, but so that's a modern misreading of ancient texts. And all it is meaning is that Mary, Philip, and some of these others are privileged and are right up to, maybe even beyond, people like Peter and James and John in receiving these new insights. And so that explains why you, the proto-Orthodox, had not heard of this before. It's because it was shared to a very small elite group that goes back to somebody like Mary. And now, of course, here it is in our special text. So that's a lot of what's really going on. And that's a 2nd century phenomenon.
David.
Let me just add the idea that the Gospel of John, there we have Jesus speaking as the eternal Logos, who was with God and is God from eternity, who becomes flesh, comes to the earth, becomes flesh, and speaks and teaches and gives revelation. And the Gospel of John is full of sayings, as you know, that we don't have in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Therefore, we have a kind of bridge, if you will, to some of this 2nd and 3rd century or 4th century gospel, so-called gospel literature, because the Gospel of John purports to give teaching from the real Jesus, who has the same disciples and does the same basic things and has a passion story with very specific events and data in that passion story. If you read John's Passion, it's more detailed. It's got names that the others don't have. One cannot simply dismiss the Gospel of John as simply unhistorical or as some special revelation that's trotted out in this new text. But the point is, Jesus spoke in the ways that the Gospel of John gives us, which then says, okay, are there other times when Jesus spoke to other disciples with other special teaching? And think of also already in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, Jesus speaks in parables. Why? So that the masses may not fully understand. And he has to take his disciples aside in special teaching sessions, right? Mm-hmm. And explain to them the mysteries of the kingdom of God. Now, by all measures of teaching effectiveness, the disciples still had a lot to learn by the time Jesus gave them the special teaching. But there's the impetus. Jesus did teach special things to special people, and since he had been raised from the dead, and since the Gospel of John seems to have this almost post-resurrection feel to it, that opens the way for other people in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to say, okay, well, Jesus must have spoken. And in fact, we have some ideas that he spoke to Philip or to Mary Magdalene, whoever. So that's part of the larger story of what is the gospel.
What's going on in the Gospels at that particular point? Well, let's go down to Graham at this point. And Graham, if Jesus had been married, what's the sin in that? What's the problem with that? What's the theological downside, upside, if Jesus had been married?
Well, if Jesus had been married, then he had 2 brides. Because the church is the bride of Christ, according to the New Testament testimony. And I think that would make a quite confusing theology. Jesus, who is actually a polygamist, is a new thought, isn't it? Especially with the way our New Testament actually reads. So the fact that our Lord was not married to a woman, I think, is particularly important for the coherence of our understanding of who we are as the church.
So does this convince you that Jesus was married to Mary? Is
This
some
particular
secret
document, I thought it was very convincing until I read this Simon Gathercole on it. And when I read him...
And what did Simon say? What did Simon say?
Well, Simon pointed out 5 reasons why it's a fake. So we may hear more of that in a minute.
All right, let's hear it. So you think it's a fake, Simon? Is that a good way of describing it? In other words, not authentic, not an ancient document?
Yeah, I suppose there are 2 kinds of fakes of this kind of literature. One is the 2nd century fake, like the Gospel of Thomas. And when we talk, of course, of the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, we're not assuming, of course, no scholar assumes that the Apostle Thomas or the Apostle Philip really wrote these Gospels. So in a sense, there's fakery going on in the ancient world as well. But this is not that kind of fake. This is a modern fake. And by modern, we mean
forgery? Could we say a forgery?
Yeah,
okay.
Forgery. By that we mean in the last 10 years, kind of fake rather than ancient. Yeah. And there are a number of reasons that scholars have adduced for.
So why would somebody do that? What would be the payoff in a modern sense of creating this?
Well, I think payoff is probably the key word there. I mean, someone
tenure? Could you call it tenure?
Someone sold this to Harvard Divinity School for a large sum of money. So we don't know how much, but yeah, this is.
They have deep pockets at Harvard.
Yeah.
So you think it's? Let's get everybody else's opinion based on this. Dr. Evans, is this an authentic early Christian manuscript? You think? Pass the mic down to him. Let's hear what he said. This is an authentic early Christian manuscript?
No, it is not. There are several reasons for it. I'll just mention a few, and Simon and David Moessner can add to them. But one of the problems immediately, I don't think this text had become known more than about 2 weeks. It had been kept secret. Karen King read a paper in Italy, and
a little closer, just a little bit closer.
And this picture you're looking at was put online along with her text.
Yeah.
And
kind of like.
Okay.
Oh, think of yourself as Madonna.
Yeah. Would you like to hear my rendition of "Don't Weep for Me, Argentina"? I mean, it's very moving. Anyway. So what was noticed almost immediately, Francis Watson gets, I think, honorable mention here. He noticed that most of the text comes from the Gospel of Thomas, 2 or 3 key passages. Somebody else just within another week or two found out, oh, wait a minute, all of it comes from the Gospel of Thomas with the exception of 1 or 2 words. And what really got awkward, and many of us were telling this to Karen before she published it, in Harvard Theological Review. She was going to publish it right away, and this led to a delay. She had wanted to rethink it. But apparently, the faker of the text behind us was using an online edition, an interlinear where the Coptic is written out and the English is written underneath it, actually made a mistake or two in the way it's presented. There's an actual typo, and the faker carried it over and was also misled by a word break. And so these are some really glaring things. And so there's a modernness to this inside this text. The other problem is the papyrus was dated to probably the 7th or 8th century. And so we never doubted it was an ancient papyrus. But the style of Coptic, the dialect, is a type of dialect that had already died out 200 or 300 years earlier. So we had an anachronistic problem. And then there were just a number of other problems. The whole idea of Jesus' wife thing seems to be a modern understanding of what I was talking about earlier. But other things can be said. The ink looks too dark, black, glossy. When I saw that picture you're looking at, the news story broke. Days later, I quipped, this text is modern. It's not even as old as my grandson. And as it turns out, I think I got it right. But I'll let Simon say more.
Yeah. Simon, you want to add to that at all?
No, Craig Evans is right there that the key influence on this text is the Gospel of Thomas. And that on its own would not be too much of a problem. You know, the Gospel of Thomas did influence a few other ancient documents. But what's striking is that this is pretty much a carbon copy of not just the Gospel of Thomas, but the translation of the Gospel of Thomas that we happen to have that has survived. And so the idea that this is an ancient text going back to the 2nd century, originally written in Greek.
Let me argue the other side. Doesn't Matthew use Mark? Could this be an example of this document using some other document? Scholars will argue that Mark was prior to Matthew, that Matthew probably used Mark in some sense. Could that be what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, of course, ancient documents use each other all the time, and I suppose the difficulty that specific to this text is that we'd have to suppose that The author of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was writing this in Coptic around 7th or 8th century, as Dr. Evans has mentioned, and happens to have the 4th century manuscript of Thomas that has come down to us. Now, the Gospel of Thomas existed in lots of different forms. Whenever you translate, it was originally written in Greek, and it existed in a few slightly different Greek versions, and then was translated into Coptic. Now, when you translate a text into another language, you make hundreds of translational decisions all the time, as anyone who's ever translated anything will know about how to render particular words, how to structure sentences, and so on. And so the miracle here is that if this was an ancient 2nd century text, then it would have had to have made the identical translation decisions when translating into Coptic as the Gospel of Thomas translator made.
But let me play the other side on that. Let me play the other side. And here's why. Because if you look at any modern translation of Gospel of John, NRK, Ein Hologos, everybody says, in the beginning was the Word. In other words, could there not have already been translation decisions that were in the air or that had influenced the tradition as such that those decisions would already been made? Is that possible?
It's possible, but I think what we see in Coptic translations of the New Testament is that actually, even for very standard formulaic expressions like Jesus said to his disciples, there are lots and lots of different ways in which that's one of the things I explore in the article. There are lots of ways in Coptic that you can say Jesus said to his disciples, a lot more than there are in English.
In terms of word order and such, things like that.
Yeah. You can. Because as is the case in lots of foreign languages, especially ancient languages like Latin, Greek, and Coptic, you can vary word order a lot more than we can in English because you have endings which tell you whether something is the subject or the object, and so there's not such a pressure to stick to a particular word order.
Let's come down to Graham for just a moment. Graham, if Jesus had been married, why would the Catholic Church have covered it up all this time? Isn't it a great conspiracy that Dan Brown is finally just sort of unearthed for us all, and others like him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I need to talk to Pope Francis about that one.
It's buried deep in the Vatican. There's albino monks involved, I think. So,
well, if you were going to run that argument, it would be incredibly difficult for the doctrine of priestly celibacy, wouldn't it? If Jesus had indeed been married. So if you want to run an argument or a conspiracy argument, that would be the kind of thing you would say needed to be particularly covered up. Although if you actually know the history of Catholicism, and when celibacy actually was defined as a doctrine, and priests with concubines and the like, especially thinking of the first millennium, the history is a little bit more checkered than that conspiracy theory might allow.
If Jesus had been married, David, let me ask you this. If Jesus had been married, let's assume for a moment, would the other Gospels have covered that detail up? It's hard to say what they would have done, but based upon what you're reading of the text, if Jesus really had been married, would the Gospels have covered it up?
It's hard to imagine a Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, for that matter. In other words, the Gospels you just asked about. It's hard to imagine that Jesus, who is presented as somebody who is free to go out and choose disciples, and from whom we hear that he has really no home, no place to lay his head. He goes from place to place. He has a kind of unparalleled authority about the way he relates to people, and people flock to him. There's not one slight indication that anywhere along the line he has some familial duties or filial duties to another person, a woman, in this case of a wife. So the whole picture that we have, which is fairly consistent with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also with John in the sense that you have him in much longer episodes at various locations in Palestine. And in the way that Jesus relates to women, he relates to women as disciples. He calls them. They're with him. That also would say, was he then also having a wife with him as well? There's not the slightest evidence for that. So it would be very hard, in other words, to answer your question directly, it would be very hard for the church's Gospels to hide the fact that Jesus was married.
And Simon, let me ask this. Would they have wanted to hide that fact? If he had been married, would they have wanted to hide it? Because, I mean, the first commandment is be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, right? Mm-hmm. And Jesus didn't do that. He disobeyed the very first commandment, which is be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, according to a Jewish perspective, because marriage is regular. Everybody's supposed to marry, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the expectation?
I did read an interesting article about 3 or 4 years ago, though, that many Jewish men actually married in their sort of mid to late 30s. Actually, that was one of the sort of most acceptable ages to get married to. Maybe Jesus just didn't get a chance to, you know. No. I mean, I think one of the things that's striking about the absence of reference to a wife in the Gospels is that if you read through, for example, Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars from the early 2nd century, where Suetonius has mini biographies, well, not mini biographies, standard length biographies for the time, many of which are about the same length as a gospel. Biographies of the emperors, beginning with Julius Caesar, going up to near Suetonius' own time, the first 12. In, I think, every one, there might be an exception, the wife or wives, plural, are mentioned of those emperors. So it's sort of, if you regard the Gospels as a similar kind of writing to that, as a biography, as is their sort of closest analogy in ancient literature, the standard thing would be to mention wife and children. So
that would be a normal, natural thing to do.
Yeah, and so if you don't...
And being married is not sinful.
No.
Being married is not wrong.
No, and so you would mention...
Bearing children is not a sin.
Yeah.
Right?
I think the other thing to notice as well, of course, is that Jesus radically redefines the nature of the family in the course of the Gospels as well.
Right.
His mother and brothers and sisters are those who obey God's word. And so that might be an additional reason for thinking he might be dubious and skeptical about having a wife according to the flesh.
Let's get Graham in first, and then David, and then bound to Craig.
Jesus is filling the world with a new humanity. So he is multiplying and filling. Back to the bride.
He is multiplying in just a different way, right?
Also, in Christian theology, in every mainstream of Christianity, the resurrected Christ is the Jesus of Nazareth. There is no doubt that this is the same person. But the Christ who's raised from the dead, whose bodily resurrection is now accomplished, and death and evil powers have been conquered and defeated, that the resurrected Christ is the representative human person for all people, men and women. He's not simply the male leader of a new humanity who males must now follow in line with this new vision of humanity with the male at the head. The resurrected Christ is the completed, full human being that God had intended for humans to have. Therefore, if Jesus had been married, going back to that same question, the resurrected Christ does not indicate in the slightest way that there was some other person that Jesus had been united with. To go back to Graham's point, there is no other person in Jesus' life who had been close and would be described as of one flesh with Jesus, as marriage is described by Genesis and so forth. So the likelihood of Jesus being married and the resurrected Christ being then separated from his wife at that stage that would have caused waves. There would have been some indication that this has taken place, but no. Jesus is the human person for all people who has conquered death and has saved humanity from itself. So,
Okay. Pass it on down to Craig. Craig wants to add something here, I think.
I think for me, and I think for most, what is decisive is we do have opportunities in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, where if Jesus had had a wife, she would have been mentioned. You think of Mark 3. His family is troubled. I mean, it's an interesting passage. Jesus has been casting out evil spirits. There's a hubbub, and Jesus is teaching, and he's told your mother and your brothers are outside and want to see you. There's nothing about, oh, by the way, your wife and children are outside and they want to see you. That's Mark 3. Mark 6, Jesus returns to Nazareth to preach, and people say, well, now, isn't this the son of the carpenter? His mother, his brothers, and his sisters are here. Isn't it interesting? There's nothing about his wife and his children are here. And then in John 19, Jesus is dying on the cross, and they're watching his death is his mother Mary and the beloved disciple, whoever that is. And so we have that famous conversation where he says to the beloved disciple in reference to Mary, this is your mother, and he says to her, this is your son. Again, where's the wife? There's no reference, oh, by the way, look after my wife and my young children. And in the book of Acts, Mary is mentioned. The family of Jesus continues. There are references to James. Again, why is there no reference then to a wife? If Jesus had left behind a wife, never mind children, the wife would have been famous. And there's no way a wife of Jesus could simply disappear and not leave a trace, or children disappear.
Well, the brother of Jesus becomes the head of the church, right?
James
to be
becomes
part
the
of the family of Jesus was important.
So who is the woman then that's related to Jesus that becomes famous? Ultimately, it's Mary, his mother, not some mysterious, never existed wife.
Just a footnote to that. I think even earlier than the Gospels, there's a striking place where Jesus' wife would have been mentioned had she existed. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is talking about the rights of apostles. And he says, do we not have the right to take a sister as a wife, a Christian woman as a wife, like the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Now, that would have been a golden opportunity to say, we as apostles, of course, have the right to take a wife like Jesus did. And that's, in the 50s, only a few years after the first Easter.
We've got to move on to our second topic, but kind of the last question. This is an undergraduate question. So what? The big so what question. Why is it important to read these texts? Because they're not in the Bible anyway. Why do we read these texts? Why is this important to even discuss? It's not in the Bible. Graham?
I'd only been a Christian less than 12 months, and I was in my first year at the University of Sydney. And I noticed on the notice board that there was going to be a lecture by a renowned classicist, Professor E.A. Judge from Macquarie University, on the Jesus of myth and legend. And I went along quite fearful that maybe, because I was so ignorant really of the text of the Bible at that stage, that maybe I'd made a grand mistake in embracing Jesus. So I went along, and for the first 50 minutes he lectured on the infancy gospel of Thomas, and the gospel of Thomas, and the gospel of Philip, and on it went. And in the last 10 minutes he said, now, if you want to see the difference between those whose pious imagination, religious imagination, had got to work, and those who thought they were writing about things that really did happen, I suggest you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that was the end of the lecture. And I must say that having taken that up and started reading some of this literature, I think the palpable difference really struck me. There is a restraint in our Gospels about the physicality of Jesus at a whole number of levels that I didn't see, say, in the infancy gospel of Thomas, for example. And I found that very faith-confirming. Now, not everyone's going to do that research, so in our kind of tradition, you need to know that there are people who've done that kind of research and can stand where Professor Judge stands.
David, we're watching television, A&E Channel, History Channel, and Karen King, somebody from Harvard comes on. This is Harvard. Says that this might indicate that Jesus really did have a wife. What are we to think about that? How do we think about it?
Well, first of all, most of you have probably heard of the Jesus Seminar, and maybe have had speakers here who've talked about that. So, and then you had, for a while, a Q seminar. It was popular among some circles. And in your classes, whether it be lay education in a church or Sunday school classes or situations like this where we have special occasions where we learn about Jesus, you ask the question, why is this important? Because word gets out that there are some new gospels, right? Every Easter, notice the Time magazine, and it used to be Newsweek when they were still in print, would have some great new discovery. Remember the discovery of Jesus' tomb? That was, 5 years ago, something like that. So 9 years ago, was that already?
Time flies.
So we are bombarded with this so-called new information, these new discoveries, these hidden gospels that suddenly have been unearthed, and now they're there, and now they give us a new understanding. Jesus had a wife, in fact. So we hear these things, and so the reason we want to look at these, as we are doing today, is to get a good understanding of what really is going on. How valid are these claims? Where are the texts? Who discovered these texts? Who are the ones that deciphered and edited them? And do they know the ancient languages that they can actually tell us what's on these texts and so forth? So when you have a Simon Gathercole in your midst, you defer to him and let him tell you what's on the text and what the chances are that this is a legitimate ancient source that we should take seriously. So the short answer is we want to know who Jesus was and who Jesus is. And when somebody says, oh, he had a wife, okay, we want to know, show us that that's true. And in this case, I think it's patently clear that Jesus did not have a wife in terms of any text that would make us think that or believe
Except
that.
perhaps the church, right? The bride of Christ. Except for that. Now I'm going all metaphorical and everything. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you're arguing what exactly, David?
Huh?
What are you asking exactly?
I'm just wondering if it's possible that this text, I've had somebody say, didn't know much about this, but said, Jesus and my wife, of course he meant the church. That's what he meant.
Oh, in this particular
fragment, this particular text.
fragment, I think if you read it in context, that would be more difficult to actually be persuasive. But it's the sort of question that's asked that's really hard to answer unless you actually get down and look at the text and ask questions of the text in the presence of the person who's asking that or making that very claim. As long as we keep lots of things abstract and away from the concrete text themselves, that's what really can keep fueling this, it seems to me. It's like, I taught philosophy for many years. Can we really ever understand the meaning of a sentence? Well, I hope so, because I've just uttered a question, for example. I hope you can understand that. But leaving that to one side, there are lots of questions we can ask, and they seem very engaging, as long as you don't actually ask it of something concrete. Like, here is a text, can we together understand what it might be meaning?
Very good. All right. Last word on Gospel of Jesus' wife. Gentlemen, anything in particular? Have we exhausted that altogether?
I don't want to say the last word. I think Simon should.
Simon probably should, yeah.
Mark 3 that Craig, you mentioned is important because there Jesus is gathering now a following, and Jesus' kinsfolk, relatives we would say, cousins and extended family, are calling for him, and they try to get him to come out to them. After all, if he's part of the family, he should be with the clan, right? He should be there. And Mark's narrator says they thought Jesus was a bit, something not quite right. Exeste, outside of himself. Well, that's not what you say about, and then he calls in people in and says, you are my mother, you are my brothers, you are my sisters. This is a new definition of family. That doesn't quite work if Jesus has a wife. So it doesn't make sense, what we have in the Gospels, if Jesus had a wife.
Simon, any final word on this topic?
Yeah, just, I mean, it is worth finding out about these kind of conspiracy theories, just because of the point that David made. They do pop up all the time, you know, if not every Easter, then a lot of Easters, and, you know, every 10 or 20 years or so, someone writes some crazy book that actually sells millions of copies. You know, in 1960, it was The Last Temptation.
And then Craig writes a book telling why it's not the right thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So in 1960, it was The Last Temptation of Christ. In the 1980s, it was The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, or The Holy Grail and the Holy Blood, which, again,
Holy Blood, Holy Grail,
made the point that, made the argument that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and they went and lived in the south of France and had children. And then
the south of France is great this time of year, I hear.
Yeah. And then in 2000, it was the Da Vinci Code. So we're about due for another one, you know.
Right.
So, yeah.
Craig's working on that next one. Next one. Join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you, my friend.
Join me in thanking David Cates
My pleasure.
for stepping in for me.
I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you.